The bullet tore through Tommy McGrath's chest like fire through dry timber, and as he collapsed into the dirt of Deadwood's main street, his killer threw back his head and laughed. The sound echoed off the false front buildings like a death knell, sharp and cruel in the afternoon heat. Jack McGrath watched from the shadows of Murphy's saloon as his younger brother's blood soaked into the dust, watched as Caleb Hartwell holstered his smoking Colt and spat into the dirt beside Tommy's still form. "That's what happens when you cross the Hartwell boys," Caleb drawled to his gang of four, their laughter joining his like a pack of coyotes over a fresh kill. "Let that be a lesson to anyone else thinking they can stand up to us." Jack's hand moved instinctively to his own gun, but something deeper than rage held him back. Something cold and calculating that his father had taught him before the fever took him 3 winters past. "A man who acts in anger dies in anger," the old rancher had said. "But a man who plans his justice, he lives to see it done right." Hartwell gang mounted their horses and rode out of town like nothing had happened, leaving Tommy's body in the street like discarded trash. Jack emerged from the shadows, his boots heavy on the wooden walkway, and knelt beside his brother. Tommy's eyes were still open, staring up at the merciless blue sky, and Jack closed them with gentle fingers that trembled despite his iron will. 3 days later, after the preacher said his words and the dirt covered Tommy's pine box, Jack sat in the empty cabin they'd shared on the edge of town. The silence was deafening. For 23 years, Tommy had been his shadow, his partner, his responsibility. Their parents died when Tommy was barely 14, and Jack had raised him, taught him to shoot, to ride, to work cattle. He'd tried to teach him when to fight and when to walk away, but Tommy had always been too proud, too quick to anger. The trouble started when the Hartwell gang began demanding protection money from every business in Deadwood. Most folks paid up, knowing the sheriff was either bought or too scared to act. But Tommy worked at the general store, and when Caleb Hartwell came calling for his monthly tribute, Tommy told him exactly where he could shove his demands. The confrontation escalated, harsh words were exchanged, and Caleb issued a challenge. That Tommy's pride wouldn't let him ignore. Jack knew his brother was no match for Caleb Hartwell in a gunfight. Caleb was fast, mean, and had killed at least 6 men in fair fights across 3 territories. But Tommy wouldn't listen to reason, wouldn't back down, wouldn't even let Jack stand with him. "This is my fight," he'd said that morning, strapping on their father's old Colt. "I can't hide behind my big brother forever." Now Jack stared at that same gun lying on the kitchen table, cleaned and loaded, waiting. But not yet. Not until he was ready. The next morning brought Martha Collins to his door, her face creased with worry lines that seemed to have appeared overnight. Martha ran the boarding house where most of Deadwood's decent folk stayed when they passed through, and she'd been like a mother to the McGrath boys since their parents died. "Jack, honey, you need to leave this place," she said, wringing her hands in her apron. "Word is Caleb's bragging all over town about how he put down that mouthy McGrath. Pup, he's saying if the other brother wants revenge, he knows where to find him." Jack poured her coffee from the pot that had been sitting cold since yesterday. "I appreciate your concern, Martha, but I'm not going anywhere. You can't face him, Jack. You're good with a gun, but you're not a killer. Caleb Hartwell is. He'll put you in the ground next to Tommy without breaking a sweat." Jack met her eyes, and she stepped back at what she saw there. Who said anything about facing him? Over the following weeks, Jack became a ghost in his own town. He sold the cabin to a family from back east, liquidated everything he and Tommy had built together. To anyone watching, it looked like he was preparing to leave Deadwood forever, tail between his legs like a whipped dog. The Hartwell gang laughed about it in the saloons, calling him a coward, saying the McGrath name wasn't worth the dirt it was written in, but Jack wasn't running. He was learning. He spent days in the hills outside town, watching the Hartwell gang's movements through an old army spyglass. He learned their patterns, their habits, their weaknesses. Caleb and his 4 men had claimed an abandoned ranch about 10 miles north of Deadwood as their base of operations. They'd ride into town twice a week to collect their protection money and raise hell, then retreat to their stronghold to count their stolen gains and plan their next score. The ranch was well positioned for defense, sitting on high ground with clear views in all directions. But Jack noticed something the gang had overlooked in their arrogance. There was an old mine shaft on the property, dug by the previous owner who'd been searching for silver that never materialized. The shaft ran under the main house and came up in a root cellar about 50 yards behind the barn. Jack spent 3 nights exploring that tunnel, crawling through darkness and spiderwebs, mapping every inch. The previous owner had reinforced the tunnel well, and it was still solid despite years of neglect. More importantly, it was completely unknown to the current occupants. But infiltrating their hideout was only the first part of Jack's plan. He couldn't just walk in and start shooting. Even if he managed to kill 1 or 2 of them, the others would gun him down before he could reload. He needed something more, something that would level the odds in his favor. The answer came to him while he was watching them through his spyglass one afternoon. Caleb and his boys were celebrating another successful shakedown, passing around bowls of whiskey like it was water. They drank hard and often, especially after a big score. All Jack needed was the right opportunity and the right tools. He rode to the territorial capital, 2 days hard travel from Deadwood, and visited an old Army friend who worked as a chemist for the mining companies. Captain William Hayes had served with Jack during the Apache campaigns and owed him his life from a skirmish at Copper Canyon. Hayes didn't ask questions when Jack explained what he needed, just mixed up a special batch of chloral hydrate, enough to put a horse to sleep. "This stuff is dangerous, Jack," Hayes warned as he handed over the small vial. "Too much and you'll kill them outright. Too little and it won't work at all. You sure you know what you're doing?" "I know exactly what I'm doing," Jack replied. Tucking the vial carefully into his coat pocket, the opportunity came sooner than expected. Jack was watching the ranch on a Thursday evening when he saw Caleb and 3 of his men ride out toward town, leaving only Pete Morrison behind to watch their stash of stolen goods. Pete was the youngest of the gang, barely 19 and drunk more often than sober. He'd be the easiest to handle. Jack waited until full dark, then made his way to the tunnel entrance. The root cellar was exactly where he'd remembered, hidden behind a tangle of brambles and old lumber. He crawled through the narrow passage, every sound amplified in the confined space, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it. After weeks of planning, the moment of truth had arrived. The tunnel emerged behind a false wall in the ranch house basement. Jack could hear Pete moving around upstairs, probably helping himself to Caleb's private stock of bourbon. Perfect. Jack climbed the basement stairs and peered around the corner. Pete was sitting at the kitchen table, a bottle in front of him, completely oblivious to the danger lurking in his own basement. Moving like smoke, Jack crept up behind the young outlaw and pressed his gun to the back of Pete's neck. "Don't move. Don't speak. Don't even breathe loud," he whispered. Pete froze, the bottle halfway to his lips. "McGrath, but you left town. Caleb said you ran off like a yellow dog." "Caleb says a lot of things, most of them lies." Jack reached around and took Pete's gun from its holster, then stepped back. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to help me prepare a welcome home surprise for your friends. And if you do exactly what I tell you, you might live to see morning." "I ain't helping you with nothing," Pete snarled, trying to turn around. Jack cracked him across the skull with his gun barrel, hard enough to get his attention, but not hard enough to knock him unconscious. "Look around this kitchen, Pete. Look at all those bottles, all that food, all the comfort you boys have bought with other people's blood and fear. You think any of that is worth dying for?" Pete touched the growing lump on his head and seemed to consider his options. "What do you want me to do?" "First, you're going to tell me when Caleb and the others are coming back. They'll be back before midnight." "Always are when they go to town on Thursday." Jack nodded. That gave him about 3 hours to prepare. "Good, now you're going to help me doctor some of that bourbon they're so fond of." It took careful work to add the chloral hydrate to 3 bottles of whiskey, enough to ensure each member of the gang would get a healthy dose, but not so much that it would be immediately obvious. Jack made Pete taste each bottle first, just a small sip to ensure the chemical was properly masked by the alcohol's burn. "This stuff tastes funny," Pete complained after the 3rd bottle. Funny enough that Caleb would notice? Pete shrugged. Probably not. When Caleb's drinking, he ain't thinking about much except the bottle and whatever story he's telling about killing some poor bastard. With the bottles prepared, Jack tied Pete securely to a chair in the back bedroom and gagged him with his own bandana. Now here's the deal, he told the young outlaw. If you stay quiet and don't cause me any trouble, I'll let you ride out of here come morning. But if you try to warn your friends, if you make so much as a peep when they come through that door, I'll put a bullet in your brain before they can even draw their guns. Understand? Pete nodded frantically, his eyes wide with fear. Jack could see the boy was finally beginning to understand the gravity of his situation. This wasn't some drunk cowboy looking for a quick revenge. This was something far more dangerous. Jack positioned himself in the ranch house's main room, sitting in a chair that gave him a clear view of both the front door and the kitchen. His father's Colt lay across his lap, cleaned and loaded. 6 shots that would have to be enough. The waiting was the hardest part. Every minute felt like an hour. Every sound outside could be the gang returning early. Finally, just past 11 o'clock, Jack heard the sound of horses approaching. Through the window, he could see 4 riders silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Caleb Hartwell was easy to recognize even in the darkness, sitting tall and arrogant in his saddle like he owned the world and everything in it. The gang dismounted and headed for the house, their voices loud and boisterous from an evening of drinking and intimidation in town. Jack could hear Caleb regaling his men with some story about a shopkeeper who tried to shortchange their protection payment. So I grabbed him by the throat and lifted him clean off the ground, Caleb was saying as they approached the front door. Told him if he ever tried to cheat us again, I'd burn his store down with him inside it. You should have seen his face. The laughter that followed was the same cruel sound Jack had heard 3 days ago when Tommy died. His finger tightened on the trigger, but he forced himself to remain calm. Not yet. Patience. The 4 outlaws entered the house like they owned it, which in a way they did. They'd stolen it from its rightful owner just like they'd stolen everything else they possessed. Caleb headed straight for the kitchen while his 3 companions, Dutch Kowalski, Frank Rivers, and Sam Paulson, made themselves comfortable in the main room. Where's Pete? Dutch called out, settling into a chair near the fireplace. Probably passed out drunk somewhere, Caleb replied from the kitchen. Boy can't hold his liquor worth a damn. There was the sound of bottles clinking, and moments later, Caleb emerged with 4 glasses and one of the doctored bottles. But that just means more for us. Jack watched from the shadows as Caleb poured generous drinks for all his men. The outlaw leader raised his glass in a mock toast. To Tommy McGrath, he said with a vicious grin. May he rest in pieces. The laughter that followed made Jack's blood run cold, but still he waited. The 4 men drank deeply, and Caleb immediately refilled their glasses. Good. The more they consumed, the faster the drug would work. For the next hour, Jack listened to the gang celebrate their reign of terror over Deadwood. They boasted about the people they'd killed, the businesses they'd destroyed, the lives they'd ruined. Every story was punctuated by cruel laughter and another drink from the poisoned bottle. Gradually, their voices began to slur. Dutch was the first to show real signs of the drug taking effect, his head nodding as he struggled to stay conscious. Frank wasn't far behind, blinking slowly and shaking his head like he was trying to clear fog from his brain. What's wrong with you boys? Caleb demanded, though his own words were beginning to run together. Acting like a bunch of lightweights. Sam Paulson tried to stand and nearly fell over. Something ain't right, he mumbled. Feel sick. That's when Caleb's survival instincts finally kicked in through the haze of alcohol and drugs. His hand moved toward his gun, but his reflexes were too slow, his coordination too compromised. Before he could draw, Jack stepped out of the shadows with his Colt already aimed at the outlaw leader's chest. Hello, Caleb, Jack said quietly. Remember me? Recognition dawned in Caleb's bloodshot eyes, followed quickly by fear. McGrath, but you left town. I never left. I've been watching you, learning about you, planning for this moment. Jack's voice was as cold as winter wind. Did you really think killing my brother would be the end of it? Dutch tried to reach for his gun, but the chloral hydrate had done its work too well. His hand barely made it halfway to his holster before he collapsed unconscious in his chair. Frank and Sam followed moments later, their bodies unable to fight the powerful sedative any longer. Caleb was still conscious, but barely, swaying on his feet like a tree in a strong wind. You poisoned us. I gave you exactly what you deserved. The same chance you gave Tommy. None at all. This ain't right, Caleb slurred. Ain't honorable. Should be a fair fight. Jack's laugh was as cold as his voice. Like the fair fight you gave my brother? Standing in the street, calling him out, knowing he couldn't match your speed? He stepped closer, keeping his gun trained on Caleb's chest. You want to know what's not honorable? Laughing while a good man dies in the dirt. Spitting on his grave. Making jokes about putting him in pieces. Caleb's legs finally gave out and he crashed to his knees. The drug was winning its battle against his consciousness, but Jack could see the outlaw was fighting it with everything he had left. I could kill you right now, Jack continued. Put a bullet in your head while you kneel there helpless, just like you put a bullet in Tommy. But that would be too easy, too quick. You see, I've spent the last 3 weeks thinking about this moment, planning it, dreaming about it, and I realized something important. Caleb's eyes were struggling to focus, but he managed to look up at Jack with a mixture of fear and defiance. Killing you won't bring Tommy back, Jack said. And it won't make me feel any better about losing him, but justice ... Justice is different than revenge. Justice means making sure you can never hurt anyone else the way you hurt him. With practiced efficiency, Jack tied up all 4 unconscious outlaws, using rope he'd prepared earlier. He dragged them outside and loaded them into their own wagon like sacks of grain. Caleb was still barely conscious, mumbling incoherently. As Jack secured him alongside his men, the ride to the territorial capital took 2 days, with Jack stopping only to water the horses and check his prisoners' bonds. The chloral hydrate kept them docile for the first day, and by the time they were fully conscious, they were securely trussed and helpless. Marshal Robert Kane was an old friend of Jack's father, a career lawman who'd been trying to bring the Hartwell gang to justice for over 2 years. When Jack drove the wagon up to the jailhouse with 4 wanted outlaws in the back, Kane nearly dropped his coffee cup. Jack McGrath? What in the Sam Hill? How did you manage this? They killed my brother, Marshal. I decided it was time someone held them accountable. Kane looked at the 4 prisoners, then back at Jack. There's reward money on all of them, $1,500 total. Jack shook his head. Don't want their blood money. Just want them locked up where they can't hurt anyone else. The trial was swift and decisive. With multiple warrants outstanding and a dozen witnesses willing to testify, the judge had no choice but to sentence all 4 men to long prison terms. Caleb Hartwell, as the gang's leader, received 25 years at hard labor. His associates got 15 years each. As they led Caleb away in shackles, he looked back at Jack with pure hatred burning in his eyes. This ain't over, McGrath. I'll get out someday, and when you do, you'll be an old man, Jack interrupted. And I'll be waiting. Jack returned to Deadwood to find the town transformed. News of the Hartwell gang's capture had spread. Quickly, and for the first time in months, people were walking the streets without fear. Business owners were no longer paying protection money, and the sheriff had suddenly found his courage. Now that the town's worst criminals were behind bars, Martha Collins was waiting for him at the train station, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Oh, Jack, honey, we heard what you did. The whole town's talking about it. I didn't do it for the town, Jack replied quietly. I did it for Tommy. I know, dear. But look around you. Look at how different everything is now. Tommy would be proud of what you accomplished. Over the following weeks, Jack tried to settle back into normal life, but nothing felt the same. The cabin he'd shared with Tommy was sold, their joint business. Ventures were dissolved, and everywhere he looked he saw reminders of his brother's absence. Deadwood held too many memories, too much pain. The decision to leave came gradually, like water wearing away stone. Jack realized he couldn't move forward while surrounded by the past. He needed a fresh start, a new place where Tommy's ghost wouldn't haunt every corner. He used the money from selling their property to buy supplies and a good horse, then set out for California. People said there was opportunity there for a man willing to work hard, and Jack had never been afraid of hard work. The journey west took 3 months, following wagon trains and railroad tracks through territory that grew more beautiful and challenging with each passing day. Jack found himself traveling with families seeking new lives, traders chasing profit, and dreamers pursuing gold or glory. Their stories reminded him that he wasn't the only person trying to escape a painful past. In a small farming community called Cedar Valley, nestled in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains, Jack found what he'd been searching for without knowing it. The town was growing, full of decent people who needed someone with his skills to help establish order and protect their growing prosperity. When the town council offered him the position of sheriff, Jack almost turned them down. He'd never wanted to be a lawman, never seen himself as the type to wear a badge and uphold justice. But then he remembered Caleb Hartwell's laughter, remembered the way the people of Deadwood had lived in fear, and he realized this was his calling. "I'll take the job," he told Mayor Henderson. "But I want to be clear about something. I'm not a fast-draw artist or a gunfighter. I believe in preventing trouble rather than shooting our way out of it." "That's exactly what we want," Henderson replied. "We're not looking for another Wild Bill Hickok. We want someone who can keep our community safe and peaceful." Jack pinned on the sheriff's badge 3 days later, in a simple ceremony attended by most of the town. As he stood on the steps of the newly built courthouse, looking out at faces filled with hope and trust, he thought about Tommy and wondered what his brother would think of this moment. The first year was challenging but rewarding. Jack hired 2 deputies and established regular patrols, built relationships with neighboring communities, and worked to create a network of communication that would help prevent crime before it started. There were a few incidents that required his attention, but nothing like the violence and fear that had plagued Deadwood. Most importantly, Jack discovered he had a talent for talking people out of bad decisions. When heated arguments erupted between farmers over water rights, when gambling disputes threatened to turn violent, when young men got too drunk and too proud for their own good, Jack found he could usually diffuse the situation with patience and understanding rather than bullets and threats. "You've got a gift for this," Deputy Miller told him after Jack successfully mediated a land dispute that could have turned into a range war. "Never seen anyone calm folks down the way you do. My father taught me that most people aren't really bad," Jack replied. "They just make bad choices when they're scared or angry or desperate. Give them a chance to step back and think, and usually they'll do the right thing." 2 years after arriving in Cedar Valley, Jack met Rebecca Martinez, a schoolteacher who'd come west from St. Louis to educate the growing number of children in the area. She was intelligent, compassionate, and completely unimpressed by his reputation as the man who'd brought down the Hartwell gang. "So you're the famous Jack McGrath?" she said when they were introduced at a town social. "I heard you captured 4 dangerous outlaws single-handedly." "I did what needed to be done," Jack replied, uncomfortable as always with praise for his actions in Deadwood. "And now you're doing what needs to be done here," Rebecca observed. "Building something instead of tearing it down. That's much more impressive than any gunfight." They courted for 8 months, taking long walks through the valley's oak groves, sharing quiet conversations about books and dreams and the kind of future they wanted to build together. Rebecca understood Jack's past without needing him to explain it, and she loved him not despite his scars but because of how he'd chosen to heal from them. They married in the spring of 1882. In a ceremony that brought together the entire community. As Jack stood at the altar watching Rebecca walk down the aisle in her mother's wedding dress, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Tommy's death: complete happiness. Their first child, Thomas McGrath, was born the following winter. As Jack held his son for the first time, he whispered a promise to the tiny baby and to his brother's memory. "You'll grow up in a world where good people don't have to live in fear. I'll make sure of it." Years passed peacefully in Cedar Valley. Jack and Rebecca had two more children, built a comfortable home on the edge of town, and watched their community grow from a collection of farms and shops into a thriving small city. Jack's reputation as a fair and effective lawman spread throughout the territory, and he was often called upon to help other communities establish their own law enforcement systems, but the past has a way of catching up. Even when you think you've left it far behind. In the summer of 1887, 5 years after Jack and Rebecca's wedding, a stranger rode into Cedar Valley. He was an older man, weathered and hard-looking, with the kind of careful eyes that missed nothing. He asked questions around town about Sheriff McGrath, casual questions that might have seemed innocent to someone who didn't know what to listen for. Jack knew immediately who the man was before anyone told him. The family resemblance was unmistakable, even after all these years. This was Cole Hartwell, Caleb's older brother, and he'd come to Cedar Valley for one reason only. They met at sunset on the town's main street, just like something out of a dime novel. But this wasn't fiction, and Jack had too much to lose to play the role of a gunfighter. "You must be Cole Hartwell," Jack said, walking slowly toward the stranger, with his hands visible and empty. "And you're the son of a bitch who put my brother in prison?" Cole replied. His hand hovered near his gun, but he didn't draw. "Not yet. Your brother put himself in prison when he chose to become a killer and a thief. I just made sure he got there. Caleb died in that prison last winter, lung fever. He was only 32 years old." Jack felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief at the news. "I'm sorry for your loss. But if you've come here looking for revenge, you're making a mistake." "Am I?" Cole's eyes were cold as winter stone. "Seems to me you took everything from my family. Now I'm going to return the favor." "Look around you," Jack said, gesturing to the peaceful street. "The families going about their evening routines, the children playing in front yards. This is what your brother's death accomplished. Good people living without fear. You want to throw your life away for revenge? Go ahead, but it won't change anything except leaving more families grieving." For a moment, Jack thought his words might have gotten through. Cole's hand moved away from his gun, and something almost human flickered in his eyes. But then the hardness returned, and Jack knew talking wouldn't be enough this time. "Draw," Cole commanded, his voice flat and final. Jack shook his head. "I won't draw on you, Cole. If you want to kill me, you'll have to murder me in cold blood in front of all these witnesses." "Is that the kind of man you want to be remembered as?" The standoff stretched on for long minutes, neither man moving, the entire street holding its breath. Then Rebecca appeared at Jack's side, having left their children with neighbors the moment she heard about the confrontation. "Mr. Hartwell," she said calmly, "my name is Rebecca McGrath. I'm Jack's wife and the mother of his 3 children. Cole glanced at her, then back at Jack. "This ain't your concern, lady. Everything that affects my husband is my concern. But I want you to know something. Jack still has nightmares about your brother sometimes. Not because he regrets what he did, but because he wishes it had never been necessary. He takes no pleasure in the pain he caused your family." "Words?" Cole spat. "Just words." Then let me give you something more than words," Rebecca continued. "If you kill my husband, you'll destroy 3 innocent children who love their father more than life itself. You'll make a widow of a woman who's never done anything but try to help people. And for what? Your brother is dead, Mr. Hartwell. Your revenge won't bring him back." Jack watched Cole's face as Rebecca spoke, saw the conflict playing out behind. His eyes. This was a man who'd spent months, maybe years, planning this moment. But he was also a man who still had enough humanity left to be affected by Rebecca's words. "He killed my brother," Cole said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "No," Jack replied quietly, "I arrested your brother. The law killed him, and his own choices killed him, but not me." The silence stretched on until it became unbearable. Then, slowly, Cole's hand moved away from his gun. "You're right," he said. "Finally, Caleb made his choices, and he paid for them. I guess I don't need to pay for them, too." He turned and walked back to his horse, mounted up, and rode out of town without another word. Jack never saw him again. Though he heard years later that Cole had settled in Oregon and become a successful farmer, that night as Jack tucked his children into bed, his youngest daughter asked him about the man who'd come to town. Was he a bad man, Papa? Jack considered the question carefully. He was a hurt man, sweetheart. Sometimes hurt people do bad things, but that doesn't make them bad people. He just needed to remember who he really was, like Uncle Tommy? She asked. Jack had told his children about their uncle, about the good man he'd been before anger and pride led him to make a fatal mistake. Yes, Jack said, kissing her forehead, like Uncle Tommy. As the years passed, Jack's reputation as a peacemaker grew. He helped establish law enforcement agencies in dozens of communities throughout California and Nevada, always emphasizing prevention over punishment, understanding over vengeance. The techniques he developed became a model for other lawmen dealing with frontier violence. When he finally retired as sheriff of Cedar Valley in 1895, the town council erected a statue in his honor in the center of the main square. Jack protested the gesture, saying he'd only done his job, but the community insisted. The inscription read, "To Jack McGrath, who taught us that justice and mercy are not opposites, but partners in building a better world." At the dedication ceremony, Jack stood before the gathered crowd with Rebecca and their 3 children at his side. As he looked out at the faces of people he'd protected and served for 15 years, he thought about the long journey that had brought him to this moment. "I want to tell you about my brother Tommy," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "He was a good man who made a bad choice, and it cost him his life. For a long time, I thought the best way to honor his memory was through revenge. I was wrong." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "The best way to honor someone we've lost is to build something better in their memory, to make sure their death means something by preventing others from suffering the same fate. That's what we've done here in Cedar Valley, and that's what I hope we'll continue to do." The crowd erupted in applause, but Jack barely heard it. His attention was focused on a figure standing at the back of the crowd, a young man with familiar features who was applauding as enthusiastically as anyone else. After the ceremony, the young man approached. "Sheriff McGrath, my name is David Hartwell. Caleb Hartwell was my uncle." Jack tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward where his gun would have been if he'd still been wearing it. But there was nothing threatening about this young man's demeanor. "I wanted to thank you," David continued, "for showing my family that there was a better way. My father, Cole, told me about what happened here 10 years ago, about how your wife's words changed his mind about revenge. Because of that conversation, I grew up with a father instead of growing up planning to avenge him." Jack felt tears prick his eyes as he shook the young man's hand. "What brings you to Cedar Valley, David?" "I'm starting my first job as a school teacher in Sacramento. But I wanted to stop here first, to see the place where my family learned about forgiveness. I brought something for you." He reached into his coat and pulled out an old photograph, faded but still clear. It showed 2 young men standing beside a corral, their arms around each other's shoulders, both grinning at the camera. "That's my Uncle Caleb and my father Cole, taken before things went wrong. I thought you should see that Caleb wasn't always what he became. He was someone's brother too, someone's son. Maybe if more people had remembered that, things would have been different." Jack accepted the photograph with trembling hands. In it, he could see echoes of the man who'd killed Tommy, but also something else: youth, hope, the possibility of a different path. "Thank you," he said quietly. "This means more than you know." As David Hartwell rode away to begin his new life as a teacher, Jack thought about the strange circles life draws around us. Tommy's death had led to Caleb's capture, which had led to Cole's quest for revenge, which had led to forgiveness, which had now led to this young man choosing education over violence. That evening, Jack sat on his front porch with Rebecca, watching their grandchildren play in the yard while their own children, now grown with families of their own, chatted nearby. The photograph David had given him lay on the table between them. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd chosen revenge instead of justice?" Rebecca asked. Jack considered the question. "I did choose revenge at first, but somewhere along the way, I realized that revenge was just another form of the same disease that killed Tommy. It spreads from person to person, generation to generation, until nobody remembers what started it all. And now? Now I think Tommy would be proud of what we built here. Not because we stopped the men who killed him, but because we stopped the cycle that would have led to more killing, more families torn apart, more brothers lost. As the sun set over Cedar Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jack McGrath reflected on the long journey that had brought him from that terrible moment in Deadwood's dusty street to this peaceful evening surrounded by family and community. The path hadn't been easy, and the choices hadn't always been clear, but he'd learned something important along the way. Justice isn't about making people pay for their crimes. It's about making sure those crimes don't happen again. And sometimes, the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies, but helping them find a reason to stop being your enemies at all. Tommy McGrath had died in the dirt of a frontier town, laughed at by men who thought might made right. But his legacy lived on in every child who grew up safe in Cedar Valley, in every conflict resolved with words instead of bullets, in every young man like David Hartwell who chose teaching over violence. They had killed his brother and laughed, thinking they'd won. But in the end, love and justice had the last laugh, building something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy, proving that even in the darkest moments, there's always hope for a better tomorrow.